It started like any other morning in Red Hollow. Sheriff Tom Hulbridge, nearing retirement, sipped on lukewarm coffee while watching the sun creep over the distant ridgeline. The town was quiet, like always, just how he liked it. But today something tugged at him. An old newspaper clipping someone had mailed anonymously with no return address, just one line scribbled in red ink. "They never left, Sheriff. You just stopped looking." The article was yellowed, torn, at the edges dated March 17, 1930. It mentioned a class of indigenous children from Red Hollow Public School, names, faces, even a class photo. But Tom had lived in this town all his life, and he didn't recall ever hearing about an indigenous class. The school records he'd seen growing up never mentioned them either. He stared at the photo longer than he meant to. 13 children, all with solemn eyes, dressed in hand-me-down uniforms. One of them, a girl named Asha Clearwater, seemed to look right at him through the grainy black-and-white image, like she was waiting. Tom rubbed his face and sighed. He didn't have time for ghost stories or conspiracy theories. But something about that picture crawled under his skin and stayed there. The next day he drove down to the Red Hollow Historical Society, what was left of it anyway. Miss Darlene McCaffrey ran it out of the back of the old courthouse now, surrounded by dusty boxes and rusted filing cabinets. "Darlene, you ever hear about an indigenous class from 1930 at the public school?" he asked, sliding the clipping across her desk. She adjusted her glasses, then stiffened like a board. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, eyes not leaving the paper. "It was mailed to me," Tom replied. "No name, no return address." Darlene was silent for a long time. Finally, she stood and walked over to a locked drawer. She pulled out a folder marked Archived Closed Inquiries. Inside were copies of complaint letters from families, some handwritten in Cree, some in English, begging for help. Children had vanished and no one looked into it. No press coverage, no follow-up, just silence. "It was called the Reassignment Program," Darlene finally said. "Supposed to be a cultural integration effort. They sent indigenous kids to our school, but then they just stopped coming. They said the children were transferred out of state. No records were kept. None of the teachers ever spoke about it." Again, Tom frowned. "That doesn't sound like a transfer. That sounds like someone buried it." He left with copies of everything he could get his hands on. That night, sleep didn't come easy. His dreams were full of whispers in a language he didn't understand, children's laughter echoing through empty hallways, and a pair of dark eyes watching him from the woods. The next day he visited the old Red Hollow school building, now abandoned, fenced off and half-eaten by vines. The boards creaked as he stepped inside, flashlights slicing through the dust-heavy air. Lockers hung open. Desks were stacked like forgotten relics. But as he wandered into the east wing, something odd caught his eye. Room 3B. The door was sealed shut with rusty chains, and an old county seal marked, "Do not enter, closed, 1930. He knew this room. It wasn't on any of the blueprints he'd seen when he helped with renovations back in '92. He hesitated, then cut the chain with bolt cutters he'd brought just in case. The door groaned open. Inside was a perfectly preserved classroom. Chalk still on the blackboard, books still stacked. Even a child's sweater hanging over the back of a chair. But dust covered everything thick, like it had been sealed for decades. And then he saw it on the teacher's desk, a roll book. He flipped through it, hands trembling. Every name matched the newspaper clipping. Each child listed as present on March 17, 1930. And then, nothing. The next page was missing. Tom stood in the center of that room, heart pounding. Something had happened here. Something evil. And he wasn't sure he wanted to know what. But the faces of those children, staring back from that photo, wouldn't let him walk away. Not this time. Tom didn't leave the school right away. He stood in that dusty silence, the kind that feels thick and watching. The air smelled like rotting wood and time, and his flashlight flickered once, then again. He slapped it, annoyed, but deep down unsettled. Something didn't feel right in that room. It was like walking into a memory that didn't belong to him. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures of the roll book, the classroom, the chalkboard where someone had written Arithmetic, March 17th. The chalk had crumbled into tiny white pebbles untouched since that day. He made sure to get the list of names, planning to cross-reference them with anything he could find, if there was anything to find. As he turned to leave, a small thud echoed behind him. He froze, then slowly, cautiously, turned his light back toward the desk. A book had fallen from the shelf. A children's reader, Stories for Bright Young Minds. The cover had a little rabbit on it, worn down to a ghostly blur. He picked it up, hands a little less steady now. Inside the front cover, scrawled in childish handwriting, "Property of Asher Clearwater." His throat tightened. The sun had set by the time he stepped out of the building. The school's shadow stretched long behind him, and in the stillness, the kind only a town like Red Hollow can produce, he thought he heard the sound of giggling. Children's giggling, distant, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. He drove straight to the sheriff's station. The place was empty except for Deputy Reed, barely out of college, and too green to know how heavy some truths get. "You okay, boss?" Reed asked, raising an eyebrow. Tom didn't answer right away. He sat at his desk, laid out the pictures, and started a spreadsheet on his ancient desktop computer. One by one, he typed in the names from the roll book: Asher Clearwater, Benny Two Moons, Lila Rainwater, Joseph Little Elk. 13 names. Then he ran them through the state missing persons archives. Nothing. He widened the search. No birth certificates, no death records, no mention of them in any school board documents past 1930. It was like someone had erased them completely, not just from the school, but from existence. But one thing did come up: a news article from a local indigenous newspaper in 1957. It wasn't about the children, but it mentioned Asher Clearwater. The article was about a protest led by the Clearwater family, accusing the county of covering up something from decades prior. No names of the children were listed, just a warning from Asher's older brother. The town that swallows the truth will one day be swallowed by it. Tom leaned back in his chair, feeling like the ground underneath him was shifting. He needed to talk to someone who might actually remember, someone old enough to have seen the 1930s, or at least heard whispers. There weren't many left, but one came to mind. Agnes Teller, 94 years old, lived out on Reservation Road. She'd lived in Red Hollow longer than almost anyone, and had a mind sharper than a tack. The old-timers called her the town's conscience, though most folks just called her crazy. Aggie. The next morning, Tom paid her a visit. Her small house was tucked into the trees, wind chimes clinking like nervous laughter. She opened the door before he knocked. "I was wondering when you'd come around," she said, voice creaky but firm. "They told me you found the room." Tom blinked. "Who told you?" Agnes smiled, not kindly. "The ones who never left." Inside, she brewed tea the old-fashioned way. Her walls were covered in framed black and white photos, many of them unfamiliar faces. Children. Some of them, Tom realized with a jolt, looked like the kids in the roll book. "I was 6 when it happened," she said. "I remember it like a cold knife. They came in one day, those 13 kids sat in their desks just like everyone else, but the townsfolk didn't like it, said they were dirty, said they brought spirits." Tom clenched his jaw. "And then, one morning the schoolhouse was locked. They said it was illness, quarantine, but no one ever saw those children again." Her voice shook now. "And every year since, same day, March 17th, those woods get loud. People hear voices, laughter, crying, and sometimes you see them just for a second standing by the road watching." Tom didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But as he listened to Agnes talk, something inside him stirred, a kind of ancient guilt, like he was being measured by a history that never forgot. He left her house with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear now. Someone in this town had buried the truth, and it hadn't stayed buried. It was clawing its way back. Tom barely slept that night. His mind kept circling around those 13 names, Agnes Teller's shaking voice in that sealed-off classroom. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. Something ugly had happened in Red Hollow, something the whole town had agreed to forget. Or maybe been forced to forget. He stood by his window long after midnight, staring at the woods behind his house. The wind moved through the trees in waves, like breath. He could almost convince himself the shadows weren't moving on their own almost. At 6 a.m. he was already at the station. Deputy Reed brought him coffee, trying not to look too worried. Tom looked like hell. He hadn't shaved, his eyes were sunken, and his shirt was buttoned wrong. "So I'm heading up to the reservation," he said, grabbing his keys. Reed blinked. "What for?" "To speak to the Clearwater family. If anyone remembers what really happened, it'll be them." The drive out to the Hollow Ridge Reservation was quiet except for the steady beat of tires on old gravel. It had been years since Tom had gone up there, and even longer since anyone from Red Hollow had made peace with the people who lived beyond that tree line. Old wounds never healed here. They just went silent. He pulled into a dusty driveway at the edge of the ridge. A modest wooden house sat crooked on its foundation. Chickens clucked nearby. An old man sat on the porch carving something with a pocket knife. "You Halbridge?" the man said without looking up. Tom nodded. "Sheriff Tom Halbridge." "I know who you are," the man said. "You're Albert Clearwater, Asher's nephew." That caught Tom off guard. "You knew Asher?" Albert's eyes sharpened. "She was my aunt, and she never came home." Tom sat on the steps beside him. "Tell me what happened. Not what the town said, what really happened." Albert took a long breath. "My grandfather went to the school the morning after, tried to get answers, but the sheriff back then, your predecessor, told him there'd been a fever, said the kids were taken to a sanatorium in the north. But when he went up there, the building was empty. No staff, no children, nothing. He came back broken. Started drinking. Said he heard his daughter calling him in his sleep." Tom looked down at the wood grain beneath his boots. "No one's ever talked about it publicly." "Because no one listens when it's our blood," Albert said bitterly. "We put up signs, held vigils, filed complaints. The town acted like we were ghosts ourselves." Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out the photo, the one from the newspaper clipping. He pointed to Asher. "She's the only one who looked at the camera," he said. Albert nodded. "She always knew something was wrong. That's why they hated her most." Tom felt something heavy settle in his chest. "There's one more thing," Albert said, pulling out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a piece of broken jewelry, a charm on a braided leather band. "We found this behind the schoolhouse 5 years ago, after a storm knocked over a tree. It was buried under the roots." Tom picked it up carefully. The leather was cracked, but the charm, a carved moonstone, was perfectly intact. "She wore that every day," Albert said. "Said it protected her from bad dreams." Tom's fingers tightened around the charm. "I'll find out what happened to them, I swear." Albert looked at him long and hard. "You better hurry. March 17 is in 3 days." Tom froze. He hadn't even realized the date. 3 days. The anniversary of the disappearance. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in consequences. On the way back into town, Tom's radio crackled. Reed's voice came through tight and breathless. "Sheriff, you better get back here. The old schoolhouse, it's on fire." Tom swerved onto the main road, heart slamming against his ribs. By the time he got there, the east wing of the school was already up in flames. Firefighters were trying to contain it, but it was no use. Room 3B, gone, burned to ash. "Arson?" he shouted to one of the volunteers. "Looks that way," the man nodded grimly. "Accelerants used. Someone wanted this erased." Tom's fists clenched. Whoever had buried the truth all those years ago wasn't done. They were still watching, still afraid. But what were they afraid of? Later that night, Tom sat in his office going through what little evidence he had left. Photos, the roll book, the charm. It was all slipping through his fingers. And then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. A voice, soft, childlike, whispered just one word. Help. And the line went dead. Tom stared at the phone in his hand long after the call ended. His thumb hovered over the screen, replaying the sound in his head. Help. It wasn't static and it wasn't a prank. It was real. A child's voice, frightened and clear. And it sounded just like her. Asher Clearwater. He didn't know how that was possible. But then again, after the sealed classroom, the missing children, and the sudden fire, he was starting to understand that Red Hollow didn't follow normal rules anymore. Maybe it never did. Sleep wasn't an option. He pulled every file, every photo, every scrap he'd collected onto the desk and laid it out like a jigsaw puzzle made of shadows. He kept circling the same question in his head. What were they trying to hide? Then it hit him. He grabbed the school's old blueprints again, the ones from 1929 that Darlene had found in the archives. Something had been bugging him. The East Wing had a third room listed, room 3C. But in the current structure, 3C didn't exist, only 3A and the now destroyed 3B. Had it been removed? Covered up? He headed out in the middle of the night, flashlight in one hand, bolt cutters in the other. The fire had stopped burning, but the shell of the East Wing still stood blackened and steaming. He climbed over the tape, ignoring Reed's calls, and stepped through the ash. There it was, behind the frame of room 3B, hidden behind what used to be a janitor's closet, a narrow door, its surface scorched but intact. A metal plaque above it read simply, "Storage." He cut the lock and pulled it open. The smell hit him first, damp, mold, something old and wrong. The flashlight flickered as he stepped inside, into a stairwell that went down. Way down. He followed it slowly, one step at a time, heart thudding like a drum in his ears. The walls were lined with old stone, and it felt like walking into a crypt. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door. Carved into it were strange markings, symbols circular and sharp-edged, not English, not any language he knew. His breath steamed in the cold, stale air. He pushed the door open. It wasn't a storage room, it was a chamber. The walls were covered in names, hundreds of them, carved by hand, some fresh, some ancient. In the center of the room was a long, wooden bench. Shackles dangled from each end, rusted but unmistakable. Tom's gut turned. This wasn't a school. It was a holding place. On the floor lay a child's satchel, dusty, untouched. Inside it were papers, drawings, notes written in crayon. One in particular made Tom's hands tremble. They told us not to speak. They said we'd go home after the test. But no one ever comes back. I'm scared. Usher. That was when he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, bare, somewhere above. Then whispering. Children's voices. Calling each other. Calling him. He spun around, flashlight shaking. The stairwell was empty. But when he turned back, there they were. 13 silhouettes lined the far wall of the chamber. Small, unmoving. No faces. Just shapes in the darkness, standing perfectly still. Then one stepped forward. A girl. Long braids. A moonstone charm. Glowing faintly at her neck. Tom's breath caught in his throat. Usher. She didn't speak. Just looked at him with eyes too old for her face. Then, in unison, the others whispered, "They lied to us." The flashlight died. Total darkness. Tom stumbled backward, heart hammering. He clawed at the stairs, tripping over his own boots. Lungs screaming for air. When he burst into the open night again, it was like being born. He sat in the gravel for a long time, shaking. His mind refused to settle. Who were they really? What had been done to them? What kind of test had Usher written about? He couldn't answer those questions yet. But one thing was clear. This was never about illness or transfer or even racism alone. This was something far worse. And someone somewhere had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed buried. But now it was crawling back to the surface. Tom didn't go home after the schoolhouse. He couldn't. Not with those voices echoing in his head, or the way Usher had looked at him like she was waiting for something. Like they all were. He drove to the station, locked the doors, and sat in the interrogation room with the satchel, the roll book, the drawings, and that moonstone charm spread out in front of him. Each item felt like a scream no one had ever heard. His hands trembled as he opened the crayon-scrawled note again, trying to see what he'd missed. They told us not to speak. They said we'd go home after the test. What test? Who were they? That's when it clicked. He grabbed the old county directories from the archive room, flipping through dusty pages until he found what he was looking for: the Red Hollow Public Health Board, 1929-1931. Only 3 names were listed. and one of them chilled him straight to the bone. Dr. Eugene Wexley. Tom had heard the name before. A supposed pioneer in behavioral reform programs for indigenous youth. Rumors said he ran clinics that were later shut down for unethical practices, experiments disguised as therapy. Most of the files had been sealed or destroyed. Tom dug deeper. A few of the old personnel files were stored in microfiche format, the kind no one touched in years. He fired up the dusty reader in the back office and started scrolling. There. It was a memo typed and stamped confidential, dated March 1st, 1930. Phase 2 of the control trial will proceed on March 17th. Subjects have been prepared. Room 3B has been secured for overnight isolation. Another line, almost an afterthought. Compliance drugs showing mixed results, some children resisting, notably the Clearwater girl. Tom's stomach flipped. This wasn't just some cover-up, this was organized, institutional. They'd used these children like lab rats and then disposed of them. He looked again at the date, March 17th. The same day the school claimed the children were transferred. The same day the classroom was sealed off. The same day every year strange things began happening in Red Hollow. But what chilled Tom the most was what followed at the bottom of the memo. If dissociation and phase shift are successful, physical containment may become unnecessary. Subjective persistence confirmed at 12-hour intervals. He didn't understand half of it, but subjective persistence sounded like they weren't just erasing memories or moving bodies. They were messing with something bigger. Time. Consciousness, reality. And that's when the lights in the station went out. The hum of the old fluorescent bulbs died. The computer screens shut off. Emergency lights didn't come on. Darkness, stillness. And then the sound of a child crying. It came from down the hall. Tom grabbed his flashlight, hands sweating. The beam barely worked now, just a cone of weak yellow that jittered with each step. He moved past the cells toward the back office. The crying grew louder, not panicked, not loud, just soft, mournful, like someone trying not to be heard. Then he saw her, Asha, standing in the evidence room doorway soaked in dim light, her eyes hollow. "Why didn't anyone come for us?" she asked. Tom froze. "We didn't know. No one told us." A shadow moved behind her, tall, featureless, a man, or something shaped like one, lurking just out of reach. She looked over her shoulder. "He's coming again." Tom's throat tightened. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "We're still there, underneath. You have to dig. You have to make them see." Then, just like that, she vanished. The flashlight snapped off, the room plunged into silence. Tom dropped to his knees, choking on a sob he didn't realize he'd been holding. Underneath. Was she talking about the chamber, or something else? When the power finally came back 10 minutes later, Reed found him sitting on the floor of the evidence room, shaking like a leaf. "Are you okay?" Reed asked, wide-eyed. Tom didn't answer. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and stared hard at the wall. "No," he said, "but I know where I'm going next." Tom didn't sleep. He couldn't. The moment Asha whispered, "We're still there, underneath," something inside him broke open, a truth too big to ignore. He felt it like a sickness under his skin, the town, the school, the fire, the silence. It all pointed down. Not metaphorically, literally. Underneath. The next morning, before the sun even touched the rooftops of Red Hollow, Tom drove back to the ruins of the school. No one was there. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but black bones of wood and the stink of soaked ash. Crows lingered on the wires above like they knew something was coming. Tom parked behind the building at the tree line and hauled out what he'd brought, an old ground-penetrating radar unit, one of the dusty tools left over from a brief archaeological project the county had abandoned in the 90s. The battery barely held a charge, but it worked. He didn't have a map, just instinct. He swept the machine across the field behind the schoolhouse, back and forth, again and again. At first, nothing. Then, a beep, a low, whining tone. He stopped, backed up. The signal returned, strong. A buried void, not natural, maybe 10 feet wide. He dropped to his knees, dug at the edge of the cold earth with his bare hands until his nails bent. Reed showed up an hour later, confused and worried. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, staring at the growing hole. Tom didn't answer until he hit something solid. Concrete. He pointed at it. "Help me. We're opening this." Reed hesitated, but something in Tom's eyes, raw, sleepless, full of fire, made him obey. They uncovered a square of cement, about 4 feet wide. In the center, a rusted iron ring, a hatch. Tom yanked, it didn't move. Reed grabbed the crowbar from the truck. Together they pried until the seal cracked and the lid shrieked open. The smell hit them both. Like death. But older. Rotted earth, copper, and decay mixed with something chemical. Tom turned on his flashlight and peered down. A ladder disappeared into darkness. He didn't think, he just went. The descent took minutes, maybe more, 20 feet down into cold stone and blackness that swallowed the light. When he reached the bottom, his boots hit damp ground, and then he saw it. Rows of metal beds, rusted skeletal frames bolted into the floor, chains attached to each corner, and lying on those beds, no, not bodies, not exactly, remains, bones, small ones, arranged neatly. Some with shoes still on, some with hair clinging to the skulls, tiny, child-sized skulls. 13 beds, 13 sets of remains. Tom fell to his knees, unable to breathe. Reed dropped in behind him, gagging when he saw it. "Jesus, what is this?" Asha had said. They were still there. She hadn't been wrong, physically at least. Tom rose, hands trembling, and looked at the back wall. There, scrawled in charcoal or blood or both, were the words, "Test failed, begin phase 3. Beneath it, rows of tally marks, hundreds of them, and one word repeated over and over in shaky handwriting, "Sorry, sorry, sorry." Reed stumbled back. "We have to call this in, FBI, state, hell, the UN." But Tom wasn't listening. He was looking at something else, a recorder, old, reel-to-reel, still plugged into a wall socket that shouldn't have had power. He hit play. The voice that came through was Dr. Eugene Wexley's. Calm. Cold. Day 10. Subjects remain unstable. Memory fragmentation persists. Ethnic stress factors create resistance. Subject Clearwater continues to vocalize non-compliance. We begin isolation. Trials tomorrow. Then another voice, trembling. A child's. "Please, please don't take us back under." Tom shut it off. He couldn't take it. The chamber was hell itself, frozen in time. Evidence of something monstrous hidden under. A school under a town, under a lie that had lasted 50 years. But now it was uncovered. Tom climbed out of the hatch, dragging that moonstone charm from his pocket, gripping it like a promise. The silence that followed was heavy. Final. Until he turned around and saw the shadow again. Standing at the edge of the woods, watching, still waiting. Tom didn't speak on the ride back to the station, neither did Reed. The silence between them said enough, the kind of silence that only follows after staring at evil with no mask on. They'd seen the truth and now it owned them. By noon the hatch was sealed again. Not by design, just panic. They weren't ready for what came next. They didn't even know how to be. Tom sat in his office, the moonstone charm now looped around his wrist like a shackle. Every breath felt heavier, every second louder. The photos, the roll book, the recorder, all laid out before him like pieces of a curse. "I can't unsee it," Reed said from the doorway. 13 kids, shackled, lined up like animals. "What the hell did they do to them, Tom?" Tom didn't answer. He was staring at the photo again, the one from 1930. Something had changed. At first, he thought he imagined it. But no. Asha wasn't looking at the camera anymore. She was looking past it, straight at Tom. And this time her expression had changed too. No longer waiting. She was angry. He slammed the frame down and stood. "We have to release this," he said. "Everything, the files, the pictures, the chamber. Let the media take it, the state, the world." Reed nodded slowly. "And the town? They'll fight it, Tom said. "Hell, they might turn on us. But they don't get to bury this again." Before they could act, the alarms went off. Station-wide, loud and sudden, intrusion alert. Tom and Reed ran to the holding area. The front doors had been kicked open, papers scattered, and, written across the wall in something thick and red, "They're not done." Tom's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, this is Darlene. I think something's happening at the courthouse. There are people outside. They're chanting or praying." Tom grabbed his coat and rushed out. Reed followed. Outside, Red Hollow wasn't sleeping anymore. Dozens of people were gathered around the old courthouse, murmuring in low, broken rhythms. Not quite a chant, not English. Some held candles. Others just stared, eyes blank, unmoving. "What the hell?" Reed whispered. "Is that Agnes Teller?" Sure enough, the 94-year-old woman stood barefoot in the center of the crowd, her arms raised. Her eyes rolled back, her mouth moving but no sound escaping. Tom pushed through. "Agnes!" She turned slowly, like her body didn't fully belong to her. "It's too late," she said, voice warped, layered. Like a child and an old woman were speaking at once. "They don't want truth. They want justice." Thunder rolled overhead. Fast-moving clouds thickened above Red Hollow, like a bruise blooming across the sky. The streetlights flickered. One exploded. Then a scream tore through the crowd, from a boy maybe 10, now on his knees covering his ears. "They're screaming in my head," he cried. "Make them stop!" Tom backed away, heart thudding. This wasn't just guilt. This was punishment. He didn't believe in ghosts. But this wasn't haunting. This was retribution. The ground rumbled beneath his boots. The courthouse windows shattered all at once, and then, from every street, every alley they came. 13 children, silent, eyes empty, each one pale, half-faded like old memories, clothes torn, hands, filthy expressions full of sorrow and rage. They didn't walk, they moved as if gliding, toward the center of town. Asha led them. She turned her head slightly, not toward Tom, toward the mayor's house, toward the descendants of the ones who signed off on Phase 2, toward the bloodline of silence. Tom ran after them, shouting, "Stop! Asha, please!" She turned her head. "They never said." "Sorry," she whispered. Then the mayor's house erupted in screams. Glass shattered, doors burst open. People fled into the street, wild-eyed, bleeding, babbling nonsense. One man dropped to his knees, sobbing hysterically. Another tried to claw at his skin like something was crawling underneath. Tom pushed past the chaos and found the mayor slumped in the front hallway, face pale, mouth open. Not dead, just empty. Gone. His eyes stared straight ahead, lips frozen. Mid-scream, Asha and the others vanished again, into the mist, into the trees, into the underneath. Tom stumbled back outside. Red Hollow had fallen into a terrified silence, and the sky above cracked open with thunder again, one long rattling roar like the cry of the earth itself. The children were no longer asking for help. They were taking back what they were owed. The storm hit just after midnight. Sheets of rain came down like knives, slicing through the silence of Red Hollow. The streets emptied, the air turned electric, and the town, what was left of. It waited. Sheriff Tom Halbridge stood at the edge of the forest, with the moonstone charm clutched in his fist, soaked to the bone, boots sinking into mud. Behind him, Reed paced nervously with a shotgun, though both of them knew no weapon was going to fix this. The mayor's body was still catatonic. 4 more townspeople had collapsed since sunset, each a descendant of the original health board, the school staff, or the lawmen who'd signed off on the program. And each time Asha and her classmates had appeared nearby, standing, still and silent like ghostly witnesses. They weren't killing, they were judging. Tom had tried to explain that to the governor's office. They hung up on him. He turned to Reed. They want the truth spoken out loud, they want to be seen. So what? You hold a press conference with 13 ghosts standing behind you. Reed scoffed, rain dripping from his cap. You think anyone outside this cursed hole is going to believe that? Tom shook his head. It doesn't matter if they believe it. We do. He looked toward the trees. And that's who they're here for. A voice came from behind. You want to tell it? It was Agnes Teller again, this time steady on her feet, holding an old notebook. The original teacher's log from room 3B. Then start with this. Tom opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, not by the children, but the teacher, a woman named Miss Ruth Holloway, March 17th, 1930. They brought Dr. Wexley back again. Said it was only for observation, but I saw the needles, the straps, the way Asha screamed. When they tried to take her, I tried to stop them. I was locked in the supply closet for hours when they let me out. The children were gone. The room scrubbed clean. No one ever spoke of them again. They made me sign a paper saying they'd been transferred to Northern Integration School District No. 9. It doesn't exist. I checked. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I kept teaching. I'm so sorry. Tom wiped the water from his face. This is it. This is what they wanted. Reed glanced behind him. Tom... From the trees they came again. 13 figures, soaked in rain, faces pale, eyes fixed on him. Asha at the front, hair plastered to her face, moonstone charm glowing faintly around her neck. She stepped, forward slowly, never blinking. Tom raised the notebook. This is your story, he said. We speak it now, every word. He opened it to the town square, turned on a loudspeaker from the patrol truck and began to read. Not a press release, not a statement, a confession. Every note from the teacher, every memo from the health board, every detail of the room below. He read until his throat was raw, until his hands shook from exhaustion. The storm never stopped, but the thunder died down like the sky itself was listening. As the final words passed his lips, Asha stepped forward. She was close enough now for him to see the scar above her eyebrow, the same one from the school photo. A small, human thing. Her lips parted. Thank you, she whispered. Then the 13 turned and vanished. No wind, no light. Just gone. The next morning the town awoke to silence. The sky had cleared. The courthouse stood intact. No broken windows, no blood. But room 3B at the school? It had reappeared. No burn marks, no fire damage. Inside were 13 empty desks and 13 names on the board written in perfect white chalk. The chamber below had collapsed. The tunnel sealed. Tom retired a month later. Reed took his place. No more voices. In the walls. No more shadows in the trees. But every March 17 the people of Red Hollow gather in the square. They read the names. They speak the truth. And they remember the class that was never supposed to be remembered. Because forgetting is how it all began.